So I was a master student at the University of Munich in 2003. And at the time I was really thrilled about the World Wide Web. I was a content creator and I wanted to do my master thesis about that. But then my supervisor, he said that he might have an assistant position for me at hand, but on a research project on a totally different subject, and I would have to already do my master thesis on that other subject. And so I asked what that subject was, and he said the mobile telephone. And then that was like a bummer for me, because I was really wanted to do that project and become an assistant and do a PhD. But the mobile telephone at the time, that was the nicest new aspects were logos and polyphonic ringtones. And I couldn't really imagine doing much research about that. It didn't really interest me, because the World Wide Web has just done the long way from like text to being multimedia and everything. And now the mobile phone was starting basically at zero again with text message and these little things. And then so personally it didn't interest me. And then academically, especially in Germany, communication research was still very much about mass media and the public sphere. And it didn't really look like something where you could make a living out of that in communication studies at the time. But then my supervisor said, well, I see the limitations, but look at it more as an innovation. And look at how it has already evolved since the 90s and the possibilities how it may evolve over the next years. And that was really a framing that talked to me, because I had been as an exchange student in France for a year. I had done sociology of technology, and that had very much interested me. And he gave me literature to read from cultural studies on how like tactical uses that were not predicted by the producers, and all that literature. Also, I was looking forward to reusing that literature and that knowledge. And so finally, this made me decide to change the subject and to participate in that project. And perhaps one more thing on that project. It was a project that was funded by a very little percentage of the 50 billion euros or the Deutsche Marks at the time. No, it was already euros that the German government had received for auctioning off the 3G licenses. And so literally they said like, okay, people have invested 50 million euros into these licenses. Now we want to find out what you can do with them. And that was a very exciting setup for a PhD. I think it was maybe in a way the end of the beginning. So I joined, like the first event I was at was a workshop in Erfurt in 2004, I think, where there was Leopoldina Fortunati, Joachim Höflich at the time, Maren Hartmann. And it was a small community, but they knew each other very well. And it was like it worked through text, through edited books like Katz and Arcus 2002, and pre-conferences and workshops. And I think that's how it went until the late 2000s still, around those institutions. But it's very quickly institutionalized around these institutions. But this is for me still the early phase, I would say. It was Europe played quite a big role, I think, and that's also something. We still had telephone producers and even production in Europe. So Alcatel in France, Siemens, Nokia. And so it was much closer to Europe at the time. Americans were very active, like Lee Humphreys, for example. She also came to Erfurt to the ICA pre-conference. And then in Asia, it was Japan mainly that played a big role. But it was very much global north, I would say, definitely. I think it was a very, for me as a European scholar who had also the funding to just go to a workshop or a conference, it was extremely accessible. And that was also because of the personalities involved, like Rich Ling, who's just a very generous person, and you can just walk up to him. And from the point where you could somehow manage to go to a workshop, you would be able to talk to the leading scholars of the field. And it's many such personalities, Gerard, Gauguin, who are very open, accessible. It was also very diverse methodologically. From the beginning on, it was welcoming. It was not very, I wouldn't say competitive, in the sense that everybody had so different approaches that it was always very constructive. And also that I think there were not so many, there was not so much really competition in terms of papers submitted, that you didn't have a good chance to be accepted and at a pre-conference at that time. So, I mean, the trends, like technologically, so that was in the beginning, these like logos, ringtones, but then you also had the hardware. Like I think 2003 and 4 was the highest point of the phone that you could open like this. Flip phone, and then you had charms that you would attach to your phone, and that was how people personalized. And then, as I said, it was produced a little bit everywhere. There was not this ecosystem where it's produced in China. The software comes from Silicon Valley, and the apps come from everywhere, but the producers had their own operating system, I guess, adapted operating system. And so, like the Siemens smartphone had a different flavor than the Alcatel smartphone, mobile phone, even though there was not the app market, but it was quite diverse. And the form factor was very diverse, whereas now they all resemble each other. So there was, even though it was very limited in a way, it was also quite diverse on a hardware perspective and operating perspective. And then because we were in Europe, there was also, it was accessible, some things were accessible to us that are very hard to access from Europe today. Like we had 2 pilot studies that we did in our research project. And one was about navigation, the first navigation apps. I think it was in 2005. And our participant had to carry a GPS receiver around their arm. And we tested a restaurant finder in Munich. And the precision of the navigation was 700 meters. So half a mile. It could locate you by half a mile, which doesn't make sense for a restaurant finder because it just means that there are, like in Munich, there's 100 restaurants about where you are. But it was still thrilling to do the project and we to discover in that case how little sense it made, but people were still excited to try that out. Or we had the other project was with Vodafone about mobile TV, and I think that was in 2006. That was really very new, so it was still before the iPhone, and they had so exceptionally for our participants 3G, which they offered, and fast internet connections, and they could for the first time download music and watch videos, and so we were really ahead of everyone with that pilot study. Then people basically they used it mostly as a modem because they were just happy to have a broadband connection and then use their laptop. But still, I mean, those are these inventive uses also that are interesting. Next step was after this consolidation around pre-conferences and edited books. The next step came with the journal, Mobile Media and Communication, and with the interest group and the division, the ICA division, the International Communication Association. And I think that was an opening of the field also to people who were outside of that community, people who were very involved in other communities, like the computer-mediated communication, but also political communication or health communication, established scholars who started to identify the mobile communication as an interesting aspect of their research. And for that step, the pre-conference friendly, small, curated framework didn't work so well anymore. But what's interesting, I think, about that is the way the journal came into being was still totally reflection of the early phase, because it was Veronika Karnowski who had the idea during like a traffic jam, and then she called me and said, I had this idea while I was in the car stuck, and what do you think about that, and would you want to do that? And I found it a great idea, and then we just wrote an email to Rich Ling, and I mean that shows he knew us from pre-conferences, and he answered, yes, that's a wonderful idea. I would like to be part of that. And in a more developed field, more competitive field, maybe somebody like Rich Ling, he would have said, that's a good idea, but I could do that with anybody. And what we're going to do is like a call for editors, and then let the global community identify the best people to do that job, together with me as the person who is known as the head of the field. But it was this combination of Rich's generosity and then the low hierarchy and spontaneity, I think, that allowed us to create the journal perhaps in a much faster way at that point in time. And then I think what was important was that even though, so with these other scholars, there was more standardization, methodological discussion coming into the field, like having established scales, asking about the validity of measures, like measurements done by the mobile phone versus self-report. These questions, though we had that, there was still always the pre-conferences, and somehow the community still kept up this spirit of accessibility, I would say. And through the journal, because the journal, as editors, we always went to the pre-conferences, and Rich was also in both. I think that also helped to keep up both, like the quality, the higher quality, and the spirit. So one answer could be that when Veronika called me, that I did not say no, but said yes, and then followed through, like for 1 decade, funneling half of the manuscripts submitted to the journal through Scholar One, and contributing my ideas and values to the journal. And then so together with Steve Jones, who was the fourth person in the journal, and then also working as a secretary for the interest group, also something started by Veronika's initiative. And maybe on a theoretical level, the Mobile Phone Appropriation Model from 2008, which we published together with Werner Wild and Veronika, because even though it's like also one of my earliest publications, but I think it really covered very well that aspect that sometimes you underestimate of the mobile phone as an innovation, as a meta medium, as we say today. Back then we talked about it as a basic innovation into which other innovations were being embedded. And the literature was so split on that question, because you had this qualitative research, domestication, frame analysis, social shaping, and on the other hand you had extremely binary quantitative adoption models. And both have been going on like this since, but this really allowed to identify patterns of use in some diversity and how they evolve over time, but use also quantitative methods for it. And maybe one extension to that is a publication from 2018, where I realized at some point that this whole model, although it's called Mobile Phone Appropriation Model, it does not at all talk about mobility, because there's no spatial aspect in it. And then we, together with Lee Humphreys, we expanded this perspective, and we used the affordance concept to say, okay, affordances are about media innovation, because they come with new features, come new affordances, but affordances are also relational with respect to the environment. And at the time, affordances were often discussed as like through cataloging affordances of mobile communication, mobile devices. And then one affordance was like portability. And we said, no, portability is not the point. You don't use a mobile phone because it's something that you can carry around and you like carrying around things. The interesting thing of mobile media in terms of affordances is that by carrying them around, you can establish new affordances in new contexts from established media. And I think that's something that had not been so clear to the community, and that will also now become very interesting when we talk about new innovations like mobile AI, generative AI on mobile phones, for example. What's really interesting is the mobile human-machine communication. And because to some extent, it's like the smartphone, you have a technology that came up, generative AI, and then it was slowly integrated into, there's an app, even though most people still use it more through the browser than through the app, ChatGPT. But now we have a very good voice interface. You can take pictures, so it's becoming multimodal. And so in a way, generative AI is going into the smartphone as just another set of applications. But I think it's something categorically different, at least when you believe also the scholars of human-machine communication as a field. Because they say human-machine communication is about humans and machines making sense together. And I think like making sense is not an affordance. And so this is something that I'm thinking about right now, what it is. And it's more like a quality perhaps of affordances, a quality of something we do with the mobile phones. But it's something very different from doing like anything else, taking pictures or navigating with a mobile phone. And making sense is also very contextual and depending on space. And so there we have these same aspects. We have affordances that come with the innovation. We have affordances that come with the context in which you are. But we have this thing of meaning making that very much builds on them, but is more than an affordance. And I think theoretically, this is extremely interesting to study. And then, of course, there's the question, what will we ever have a hardware for mobile AI? Will it be these creepy things that just observe everything around you and don't even have a screen, so that are really just sucking everything in and then maybe talking to you? Or will maybe, is the smartphone already the app for mobile AI? So those are very interesting questions right now. So I think from my work, I'm really interested in this affordance-based perspective, but that needs to be expanded with respect to mobile human-machine communication and the question of what meaning is, for which even at the ICA I asked many human-machine communication scholars what really meaning making with the machine means, and I don't think there's a satisfying answer to that yet. So all these questions. And then for the field, I think I have the impression that for the field, it's like there have been new technologies and new trends that like washing over the field like waves since the 2000s. Interpersonal communication, location, innovation, health communication, methods. And then once those wave had gone over the field, you still see the field like standing, but still it has evolved a little bit and every wave has left its traces. And I think I'm quite optimistic or confident that the field will remain true to itself in its diversity and accessibility. And even if like we leave the smartphone behind perhaps, because the field has even looking backwards, there are great studies about fans in the revolutionary times, or about the novel, the paperback novel as a mobile medium. And so I don't think it will be a big issue for the field if at one point the smartphone will be replaced by like an ecosystem of different technologies. Perhaps also one thing that I realized when I was comparing mobile communication with human-machine communication as a new field that got institutionalized in like a couple of years ago. I think it's an interest group now at the ICA, and they have developed quite differently, because mobile communication, there was the iPhone, the killer application of mobile communication in 2007, and then the journal was founded in 2011, and the interest group in like something like 15, so much later, the field really grew together with the object of research. And in human-machine communication, it's more like there was already an interest group before the first killer application came. And so they had this whole theory was ready, but there was not yet the killer application in everyday's life that came to 2022. And I think the advantage of our field is that this growing up together with its object as it was evolving made our field very resilient towards change, because we have that innovation baked into our methods and concepts and theories. And that's also what makes me confident with respect to the further evolution of the field.